Well, good afternoon or good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Peter Klein. I am a professor at Baylor University and chair of the Department of Entrepreneurship and Corporate Innovation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Free Enterprise Forum with Paul Cantor from the University of Virginia. Baylor University has long placed an emphasis on entrepreneurship as part of its curriculum. And we have an academic department at Baylor in entrepreneurship and corporate innovation, offering a major, a minor, and even a PhD program in entrepreneurship studies. We have a number of research programs and a portfolio of outreach and engagement activities designed to help entrepreneurs and to promote the role of entrepreneurship in our society. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise, which is a research, teaching, and outreach center located within our academic entrepreneurship department. In particular, we have a free enterprise initiative of the Baugh Center that has a number of activities, including this lecture series, the Free Enterprise Forum, another series interviewing and engaging local entrepreneurs called Confessions of an Entrepreneur. You can find out more about these and other activities on the Baugh Center's blog or our YouTube channel, which also includes an archive of previous Free Enterprise Forum lectures. You can find those at baylor.edu/business/free enterprise, or you can just type Baylor Free Enterprise into your favorite search engine and you will find all of these resources. So we've been doing the Free Enterprise Forum for several years, but this is the first time we have done it virtually. The current situation gives us the chance to do a lot of different activities in addition to the standard ones and to experiment with different formats. I'm sure that probably all of you on in the session tonight have participated in quite a few Zoom activities over recent months, so you kind of know the drill. You know how all of this works. We're set up here using Zoom's webinar feature, which means that those of you who are watching the lecture will not have the opportunity to speak or be seen, so your cameras and microphones are not enabled. However, you do have the chance to ask questions during the lecture and after the lecture using the Q&A feature. So after I introduce our speaker, I'm going to turn the virtual floor over to him. And after he has given us his prepared remarks for maybe 45, 50 minutes, we'll have a chance for some questions. And I can tell you that Professor Cantor really excels at Q&A. Among other things. So I will moderate that Q&A session. So I will be monitoring the Q&A box, and I will ask those questions, as many as we can, to Professor Cantor after the talk. So we're very honored tonight to have Paul Cantor with us. He is the Clifton Waller Barrett Professor of English at the University of Virginia. He's also taught at Harvard University in both the English and the government departments. He has published very widely on William Shakespeare, including the Hamlet volume and the Cambridge Landmarks of World Literature series. In 2017, the University of Chicago Press published his most recent Shakespeare book called Shakespeare's Roman Trilogy, The Twilight of the Ancient World, and also republished his first Shakespeare book, called Shakespeare's Rome, Republic, and Empire. Professor Cantor has a popular website called Shakespeare and Politics, which provides 48 of his lectures on 17 Shakespeare plays to folks around the world. Now, we have had many Free Enterprise Forum lectures in the past, but we have not had many English professors as our speakers, and you might be wondering, why is the Free Enterprise Forum sponsoring a lecture by a Shakespearean scholar? Well, Professor Cantor, aside from being an expert on Shakespeare in what you might call the usual ways, also has a number of very interesting and thoughtful perspectives on Shakespeare and on art and culture more generally, and its relation to the commercial world, including things like entrepreneurship. Indeed, as you may know, Professor Cantor has written several books on popular culture, including Pop Culture and the Dark Side of the American Dream, with a great subtitle, Con Men, Gangsters, Drug Lords, and Zombies, that was published in 2019. He also published The Invisible Hand in Pop Culture in 2012. You economics students will recognize the metaphor of the invisible hand. He also published Gilligan Unbound, Pop Culture in the Age of Globalization in 2001. And one of my favorite Paul Cantor lecture series is one he delivered in 2006 at the Mises Institute called Commerce and Culture, which offers a tour de force, which is a tour de force and offers a fascinating tour of the commercial aspects of art, literature, music, and drama. I've heard Professor Cantor speak many times. He is an excellent lecturer, and you are all in for a real treat. So once again, please sit back, enjoy the talk, and post any questions or comments into the Q&A box, and we will discuss those at the conclusion of the formal remarks. So Paul Cantor, thanks again for visiting us at Baylor. We really look forward to your talk.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be at Baylor, even though it's only virtually. And this is an odd situation for me. It's a first for me, just as I gather it's a first for you. I've had people in the past complain, "Hey, Cantor, you're phony in the lecture." But I guess today I'm really doing that. Anyway, it's wonderful to see that we have so many participants. One thing you get on Zoom is instantaneous TV ratings. We seem to have 92 people in the audience at the moment. I can see now why they canceled the presidential debate tonight. Trump and Biden didn't want to compete with me. Anyway, I will do my best in this virtual format. I was Zooming just an hour ago with one of my seminars. So we're going to be talking about drama. And so I want to begin with a little dramatic opening, if you'll allow me. Let me set the scene for you. It's 1608. You've just tuned into the BBC's most popular television show, Ye Old Shark Tank. And here's our first guest who I'm about to impersonate. Hi, sharks. Friends, Britons, entrepreneurs, lend me your ears. In fact, even better, lend me your money. My name is William Shakespeare, and I'm here asking for £600 for a 10% equity stake in my theater company, The King's Men. Sharks, you know me from such plays as Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer Night's Dream, Julius Caesar, the ever-popular Hamlet, and my masterpiece, King Lear. Let's face it, I'm universally acknowledged to be the finest playwright in the English-speaking world. And sharks, some of you may have seen my plays at the beautiful Globe Theater. It's, as you know, just on the South Bank near the bear baiting pits. We do a great business at the Globe Theater. We can see 2,000 to 3,000 people, and we pack those groundlings in. And even at a penny a shot, we make a lot of money. But I can hear Mr. Wonderful already saying, your business is seasonal. And I have to admit he'd be right, because running an outdoor theater in London does not go very well in December when there's no daylight and there's freezing temperatures. So I'm very proud and pleased to announce tonight that we of the Kingsmen have just taken out a lease on the Blackfriars, one of London's indoor theaters. And we won't be able to pack as many people in, but we're charging them 6 times as much a ticket. And we'll be able to operate even in December. Just wait till you see our new Christmas season. I'm thinking of reviving my 12th night. So anyway, which of you sharks is willing to invest in William Shakespeare? And you all know for Shakespeare, it's always a case of all's well that ends well. And I'm not here with much ado about nothing. I'm going to give it to you as you like it. So get out those checkbooks and join with me, and we'll soon see all of us that all the world's a stage and you can make a lot of money off it. So that's my talk, actually. I've just explained to you Shakespeare's entrepreneur, but let me unpack it a bit and explain why I did what I did. And let me reassure you, especially if there are any English professors out there, that I'm not here to bury Shakespeare. I'm here to compliment him. When I call him an entrepreneur, that's words of praise for me. I realize it wouldn't be for most English professors, but my point is going to be that artists and entrepreneurs have a lot in common. Entrepreneurs need to have strong imaginations. They need to be able to imagine a future, to see where the demand is coming from, and they need to be risk takers. And that's why, in many ways, the best artists are the best entrepreneurs. But I have to say that my profession, English literary study, has had a problem with that. And for over the years, there's been a strong sense that there is a antithesis, tension between commerce and culture, so that people don't like to think of Shakespeare as a commercial artist. So much so, I'm going to read you a quotation here from an actress named Janet McTeer, whom I'd never heard of, but it turns out she was nominated for the Best Supporting Actress in 2011 for that immortal film, Albert Nobbs. Anyway, she has a bad conscience about working in Hollywood films. And she says, this is an interview with a Chicago journal called City Talk in 2001. She says, today in our world, art has to be commercial. That's a really sad point of view. If Shakespeare had to be commercial, he wouldn't have written the things he did. Now, I want to nominate that for the Academy Award for stupidity. If Shakespeare had to be commercial, he wouldn't have written the things he did. How in the world could this actress have not known that Shakespeare was a commercial artist? He was the most successful commercial dramatist of his day. But this shows you a problem that we've tried to remake Shakespeare in the image of some kind of romantic artist. In the 19th century, the English critics wanted Shakespeare to be a Wordsworth or a John Keats. They were searching for his love letters, for confessional documents to see him pouring out his soul. And all they could find was legal documents. Tremendous search to find the biography of Shakespeare in the 19th century. And indeed, it's a false idea that many people have that little is known about William Shakespeare. In fact, because the English never throw away a piece of paper, when they searched, they found all sorts of documents. Shakespeare was involved in legal cases. He was a big landowner. He owned over 100 acres of land. He got involved in real estate disputes. He sued some people for failure to repay loans. And so we really can place him at specific places at specific times, whether in London or in Stratford. But this was very upsetting to the 19th century people who worship Shakespeare. This was not what they wanted. And indeed, this is largely the origin of those crazy ideas that William Shakespeare did not write the plays we associate with that name. And for example, one of the candidates often offered is the Earl of Oxford. And the idea was, oh, Shakespeare, he can't have been a businessman. He was so inspired and so artistic. He must have been an aristocrat, for example. And in many ways, it's the refusal to accept the fact that Shakespeare was a commercial artist that has led to these strange theories that he was someone else. Francis Bacon was the first candidate, then the Earl of Oxford, and many others since then. But in fact, we should have realized that the fact that Shakespeare was very much part of the world of the commercial theater in his day was his best qualification for writing the great plays he did. I got involved back in the 1990s when I reviewed Joseph Sobrand's book, Alias Shakespeare, which is one of the books that argues that the Earl of Oxford wrote the plays. I wrote a rather nasty review of the book and touched off a bit of a controversy. And I was so thrilled and honored that no less than Charlton Heston came to my aid in the letter column in the Weekly Standard, the next issue. And Heston is mostly known for playing Moses and characters, and Michelangelo and characters like that, but he actually was a decent Shakespeare actor. And he made what was a first for me, the argument, I'm an actor, and the one thing I know is the man who wrote these Shakespeare plays was an actor. And that actually was a very perceptive comment, that the man who wrote these plays shows he's been on stage. A simple example, Hamlet. Hamlet's the longest part in Shakespeare, probably the most difficult to act. Shakespeare sets it up so that the man who plays Hamlet, and we know his name, it was Richard Burbage, didn't have to be on stage in Act 4. Act 3 is very tough on the actor that plays Hamlet. We got to be or not to be in it and all sorts of action. And then the fifth act, of course, is the big deal, the climax of the play. And so Shakespeare wrote the play so that a lot of stuff with Ophelia happens in the fourth act. And Richard Burbage can go backstage, relax, have a little ale, and then be ready to come out for the big finish in Act 5. If Shakespeare had never been on stage, he might have not have realized that, or if he didn't know Richard Burbage personally. So I thought Heston really hit the nail on the head here, that in fact what many people hold against Shakespeare, that he was a mere actor, is really the best evidence that this is the guy who wrote the plays. So let me say something about Shakespeare's involvement in the commercial world of the theater. For one thing, he was an actor, and that was rare. Very few of the famous playwrights were actors. And Shakespeare was the one who had a really sustained career as an actor. I'm guessing it's his way he broke his way into the theater world in London. He first took a job as an actor and then proved to people he could write plays. And he was very successful early in his career. And so he started making a good living being part of this company, which I referred to in my little Shark Tank sketch as the King's Men. At that time was known as the Lord Chamberlain's men. Shakespeare actually was a shareholder in this company. It was a joint stock company, and Shakespeare was one of 7 or 8 of the shareholders. He evidently had a 12.5% share. Initially, it eventually whittled down to about 7%, but he both was a shareholder in the company and in the theater. He put up money, for example, to erect the Globe Theater. And so he was getting what we would call today in Hollywood a percentage of the gross. And that's what you really want in Hollywood. Most actors get a fixed sum, but if you can get the percentage of the gross with a big blockbuster movie, you're doing very well. And that's Shakespeare's situation. Most of the playwrights at the time were paid a fixed sum for a play, maybe £6 or £7. Which doesn't sound like much, but remember, a pound is a pound of silver, and ordinary people could live on £10 a year in those days. So these playwrights were getting, only more than half a year's income, although they lived better than ordinary people. But in any case, you can see why young people, including Shakespeare, were attracted to the theater world, because it paid a lot of money. But in Shakespeare's case, it paid a real lot of money, because, as I say, he was so essential to the company that they had to make him a shareholder. And that made him deeply involved in the business operations of the company. Now, it's interesting. We know how popular he was because of all the contemporary references to him. But more importantly, Shakespeare was the first brand name among Elizabethan playwrights. Plays at this time had largely the status that movies do today. And the authorship of the plays was not of great interest to people. You don't know the screenwriter of almost any play you've ever seen unless it's a famous director who also wrote the screenplay. movies are generally marketed on the names of the stars. People will go to a Brad Pitt movie, or they'll go to a Scarlett Johansson movie. They won't go to a Joe Esterhazy movie or a William Goldman movie, even though those are two of the greatest screenwriters in Hollywood history. You never heard of them. And that was pretty much the situation when the Elizabethan theater began. Now, one of the interesting things that went on then is similar to the novelizations of films that come out now. If a play was successful, they would somehow get it into print. They would steal the script and base a book on that, or some guy would be sent into the theater to memorize the play and write it down. And so popular plays were printed. That's how we have certain versions of Shakespeare's plays, so-called quartos of the plays. But it's interesting, when these were initially published, there were no authors' names on them. They were marketed much the way films we market today. You'd have the title of the play, and then it would say, as played at the Swan Theater. So people know, oh yeah, I saw that at the Swan Theater, I'd like to buy the book now. Or they'd name the actor. Edward Allen was the first great Elizabethan actor we know of, and he created the roles in many of Christopher Marlowe's plays. So it would say something like Tamerlane as played by Edward Allen. Well, in 1598, something strange happens. A play called Love's Labour's Lost is printed, and it says by W. Shakespeare on it. And also in that year, Richard II comes out in 2 editions, and it says by William Shakespeare. Some booksellers figured out Shakespeare sold books, and that gives you some measure of the distance between him and the other playwrights. And in 1598, we get a guy named Francis Mears who writes something where he is first saying, this guy Shakespeare's a really great playwright. He's as good in comedy as Plautus was among the Romans, and as good in tragedy as Seneca was among the Romans. So Shakespeare had a name to conjure with already by 1598, and that's why the Lord Chamberlain's men gave him a share. Shakespeare was bankable, and indeed it seems that he had some kind of contract with him to deliver 2 or 3 plays a year. And indeed his output is staggering. Roughly for 20 years, he wrote 2 plays a year. And it's unimaginable that someone could write King Lear and, let's say, Othello in the same year. Frankly, it's unimaginable that a human being could write either of them. But the idea that he turned them out, and it really does seem methodical that there's 40 years, 20 years of playwriting and just under 40 plays, 37, 38 maybe. So he was the backbone of the company. And again, made a lot of money. He ended up buying the 2nd largest house in Stratford, probably because the 1st largest house wasn't available. As I think I mentioned, he owned over 100 acres of land. It's hard to compare these things, but he was effectively a millionaire in terms of his profits, because again, he wasn't selling the plays, he was getting a percentage of the income the theater company was getting off the plays. So let me go back now again to my Shark Tank sketch and explain what I was talking about there, because it's one of the most interesting and in a sense well-documented examples of entrepreneurship on Shakespeare's part. Now here I am ruthlessly stealing from an essay by Gerald Bentley, very often known in the English fashion as G.E. Bentley. It's an essay called Shakespeare in the Blackfriars Theater, and it's from the journal Shakespeare Survey in 1948. I suppose I should be doing original research for this evening, but I like the fact that this research was done by a man who didn't know anything about economics or entrepreneurship. I can't be accused of being biased and fetching out just the facts that support my claim. Bentley had no economic axe to grind. But But what he did do is ask the question, what's the story of the Blackfriars Theater? And here it is, again, for much of its profitable years. The Lord Chamberlain's men, as they were originally known, they became the King's Men in 1603 when King James came to the throne and liked drama and became their new patron. But in 1599, they opened their Globe Theater, and it was an enormous success. And we think it opened either with Julius Caesar or Henry V. In any case, as I suggested, and again, if we were on Shark Tank, Kevin O'Leary would surely bring this up, that the Kingsman business was seasonal, the real problem with an outdoor theater in London. And it does seem that the Kingsmen came to realize this. And so the Blackfriars Theater was available, and Richard Burbage and his brother Cuthbert leased it. And it took some years before they started playing there. And Bentley hypothesizes that the theater company decided to prepare for this. And what Bentley does see is things don't just happen to theater companies. It's not just that they're thrust into a new theatrical environment, but that they're intelligent enough to plan for it. And that's what he theorizes happened in the case of the Kingsmen making the addition of the indoor business to their outdoor business. And here he begins from the fact that the outdoor theaters and the indoor theaters in London were quite different and appealed to different audiences. The outdoor theaters were really the pop culture of their day, and they appealed to a largely illiterate audience. And again, we call them groundlings, and they were charged only a penny for their seats, and they liked big action productions with superheroes and blockbusters like that. The indoor theaters catered to a much more sophisticated and high-born audience. Many members of the court would go to the indoor theaters. They seated far fewer. The Blackfriars seated about 600 to 700 people, but again, you could charge more for a ticket, and the indoor theaters were upscale by comparison with the outdoor theaters. And you can surmise that Shakespeare's company saw a business opportunity. They were making a lot of money off the Globe, but they could have a winter season if they had an indoor theater, and they could cater to a better crowd, make more money per ticket. In fact, as I'll cite later, they soon came to be making more money off their Blackfriars operations than they were off their Globe operations. And moreover, it would give them a better status. The acting profession then as now was a little dubious in terms of its morals and its social status, and the actors and the playwrights for the public theaters really did feel that they were looked down upon. For example, as the King's Men, the members of the company were entitled to wear the king's livery, which is all very well, but it means you're a servant. In other words, they would have to dress up like the guys who served food in the Whitehall banqueting hall. So it was, they lived good lives and mixed among high-born people. Shakespeare became friends with the Earl of Southampton, for example, no doubt through theater connections. But in the end, and you can, if Shakespeare's sonnets are, as many think, written to the Earl of Southampton, you can see he felt bad about his low status vis-a-vis this high-born lord. So if the Kingsmen could move into the indoor theater, they could raise their status, solidify their relations with the court. Yes, they had been making most of their money off the public theater, the Globe, but there were these great opportunities to appear at court. Visiting ambassadors were in Whitehall from Venice, and they wanted to see a Shakespeare play. And by the way, that actually happened. Shakespeare was famous throughout Europe, and we have records of people who came to London saying, we want to see one of these plays by Shakespeare. The theater company could be paid almost as much for a single production as it could get for the run of a whole play in their public theater. So there were lots of reasons to get involved with the Blackfriars Theater. And the Shakespeare's company knew it well because it had been one of its most serious rivals. In the 1590s, the Blackfriars was the home of a boys' company of children who presented plays. And this was a gimmick that was very successful in Shakespeare's day. It's hard to find a modern equivalent unless you've seen the movie Bugsy Malone, which, as I recall, starred Scott Baio and Jodie Foster in what is perhaps their only film together. But Bugsy Malone was a gangster movie, and the joke of it was played by little kids. And it suddenly became funny to see little kids playing gangsters. And evidently, this amused the Elizabethan audience as well. You see this reflected in Hamlet when the theater company that shows up at Elsinore at Claudius's court, they're there because they've been driven out of their home market by little children. And you see their bitterness that the audience has become unloyal and to them and is going to watch these children. And there's a lot of joking about that. But in fact, in some ways, the most serious rival of the Lord Chamberlain's men when they were performing the Globe was the children's companies in the Blackfriars. And in fact, it erupted in what's called the War of the Theaters. And one of the playwrights who was writing for the Blackfriars at the time was Ben Jonson. Really the second greatest playwright of Shakespeare's day, but imagine being the second greatest playwright in Shakespeare's day. I mean, what a fate. This man was a very, very great playwright, but he was stuck there in the same days as Shakespeare and never got over it. Anyway, the Lord Chamberlain's men actually produced Jonson's first play, Every Man Out of His Humor. Shakespeare evidently acted in it, so they knew each other from the start. But then Jonson went over to the Blackfriars and actually wrote a very satirical play called Poet Astor, made fun of Shakespeare's company, and they came back. Thomas Dekker wrote a play called Satyromastics, which attacked the Blackfriars company. Again, this is reflected in Hamlet when there's talk of war between the theaters there. So anyway, this is how Shakespeare's company was quite familiar with the Blackfriars and what could be done there. So they decide to move to the Blackfriars, and Bentley argues that they started to prepare for it. They needed new scripts because the more upper class audience at the Blackfriars liked different kinds of plays. So evidently they started cultivating Ben Jonson, who'd already proven he could write well for the Blackfriars. And indeed, starting in the end of the first decade of the 17th century, Ben Jonson starts writing for the Blackfriars. And I think from then on, The Affair was not produced at the Blackfriars, and it gave him a very solid basis. Great plays like Volpone, The Alchemist were written for the Blackfriars. If you can't beat him, join him. Jonson had been their greatest rival, and so they incorporated him into his company. Ben Jonson was not the most forgiving man. He claimed to have shot one of his rival playwrights at one point, but it was a huge advantage to him to link up with then the King's Men because they were the most successful theater company of the time. And then Bentley goes on to argue, well, they needed young talent. And they looked around and they found two men, Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher. And here's again the entrepreneurial talent. They spotted these guys when they were really young. They were writing for the Blackfriars. Indeed, Francis Beaumont wrote a play called The Knight of the Burning Pestle, which is one of the greatest plays of the era. It's a fantastic send-up of overwritten adventure stories. I've had the luck of seeing it 3 times. It's just a terrific play. It was written for the Blackfriars. And the other advantage of Beaumont and Fletcher that Bentley points out is they were themselves aristocratic. Shakespeare's the son of a glover from Stratford. Chris Marlowe was the son of a shoemaker. Ben Jonson was the son of a bricklayer. But here Beaumont and Fletcher were well born and they had good connections. And so the Shakespeare's company figured out that they would bring in people, again, who'd proven they could write for the Blackfriars audience and had a closer association with the Blackfriars audience. And moreover, it seems that, again, we don't know what the actual deliberations were, if it was Shakespeare who said, bring in Beaumont and Fletcher. But he must have been part of the decision. And if anybody could judge a fledgling playwright, I'm guessing it was William Shakespeare. And moreover, it appears that he decided to mentor them, and especially in the case of John Fletcher. We're pretty sure that Shakespeare wrote 3 plays co-authored by John Fletcher. One of them is Henry VIII, one of them is Two Noble Kinsmen, and one of them is Cardenio. Now, many of you are saying, Shakespeare's Cardenio? Well, in fact, we lost one of Shakespeare's plays. Very, very careless of us. But there are very clear records that Shakespeare wrote a play called Cardenio. By the way, it's based on an incident in Cervantes' Don Quixote. And what it would be to have a play that Shakespeare wrote about a tale from Don Quixote. But it does seem to have been lost. There's all sorts of theories about it. People have tried to reconstruct it. I've seen a reconstructed version of it. It's very much in the mode of plays like Two Noble Kinsmen. At the beginning of Shakespeare's career, he co-authored plays. Titus Andronicus is probably written with a guy named Robert Greene, and he may have, it's now a current theory that some of the Henry VI plays were co-authored with Marlowe. Beginning and end of his career, he co-authored plays. That was the norm at the time, to co-author plays. In case of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, we actually have records that a guy named Samuel Rowley was paid £5 for additions to Dr. Faustus. They had script doctors then, as they do now. William Goldman, the greatest script doctor of all time in Hollywood. And so at the end of his career, I think Shakespeare was already looking to retire. My own theory is that he had decided it's time to prepare good texts of my plays. Because one of the sad things is we don't have good, accurate text for most of Shakespeare's plays. But it is interesting that some of the plays, particularly towards the end of his career, The Tempest, Antony Cleopatra, Coriolanus, have relatively beautiful, faultless texts. And my guess is that Shakespeare decided, okay, I've written 38 plays. It's time to whip them into shape so they can be published. And unfortunately, I believe he died too soon after his retirement. He may have retired around 1610. He died in 1616. Fortunately, some of his fellow shareholders in the Kingsmen, Hemmings and Condell, managed to publish what we call the first folio of Shakespeare's plays in 1623. I think there are 18 of the plays for which we have no other text. Anyway, whether I'm right or not, Shakespeare did retire. It's clear that he, from the dates of the plays, so far as we can reconstruct them, that he stopped writing plays before he died. And my view is, and to some extent it's Bentley's as well, that Shakespeare decided to create his successors. And it was brilliant to team up Beaumont and Fletcher. They became the most successful playwrights for the next 20 years. And their plays were, even after their deaths, their plays were played right up until 1642, when the Puritan Parliament shut down the London theaters. And in 1660, when Charles II was brought to the throne to restore the Stuart dynasty, and they reopened the theaters, the first thing they started doing was performing Beaumont and Fletcher plays. Then a little later, they started reviving the Shakespeare plays. But again, Shakespeare had a good enough eye for playwriting talent that he picked his successors, and they carried the King's Men into the next 3 decades to keep them up as the most successful theater company. And again, it looks as if he sat down with John Fletcher and said, let me show you how to write the play. But it was not a one-way street. In fact, it's very complicated because it's very difficult to date these plays precisely. The plays that Fletcher was writing, particularly A King and No King, for example, are very similar to the last plays of Shakespeare, The Winter's Tale, Cymbeline. That is, they're tragicomedies. They're plays which move in a tragic direction but have a comic resolution. And it's not clear if Shakespeare was imitating Fletcher and not Fletcher imitating Shakespeare. In any case, the artistic repertory for the Blackfriars Theater was shaped largely by a collaboration between Shakespeare and John Fletcher, and then John Fletcher started writing with Francis Beaumont. So again, this is hypothetical in the sense that we don't have records saying that any of this happened, but we know what happened. We have to say miraculously, the King's Men fell into the proper pattern for being successful in this new theatrical environment for themselves. Or we can say with Bentley, they were smart people. They knew what they had to do and they did it. So that would be one example of Shakespeare as entrepreneur. Let me close with one more example of this for you. And that's the fact that Shakespeare worked with his fellow actors. And again, these people who want to say, oh, the Earl of Oxford, he had to conceal his authorship of the plays, so he had to stay away from the theaters, and that's why they're so great. Staying away from the theaters is not a way to produce great plays. Shakespeare was in there, in the pit, with his fellow actors, and he knew what they could do. And let me give you, again, an example where the facts are documented, the explanations are not. But this is the story of the comedy geniuses of Shakespeare's company. It was 2 men named Will Kemp and Robert Armin. Will Kemp was the most popular comedian in England in the 1590s. He was the Benny Hill of the Renaissance. And indeed, the parallels probably goes deeper than I care to think about. He was a clown. And he was famous for playing clowns. He was evidently a very good dancer, and he loved working dances into his act. At one point, he danced from London to the city of Norwich in 9 days. I think it made into the Guinness Book of World Records there. He also was evidently very good at doing little dialogues with himself, where he became 2 characters and argued with himself. And we know he was a shareholder originally in the Lord Chamberlain's man. And we're pretty sure that he created the role of Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing. He was almost certainly Lancelot Gobbo in The Merchant of Venice. So many of those plays were tailored to Will Kemp's specific talents. It's controversial, but he may very well have played Falstaff. which would make him a great comic actor. It's the greatest comic part in world literature. And so here's Shakespeare working with this actor that he knows and giving them parts he wanted. Now, something went wrong. Will Kemp left the Lord Chamberlain's men around 1599, and we don't know why. He may have gotten too confident. We do know he went off and founded his own company, which, by the way, failed. But he may have wanted, may have been telling himself, I'm the reason for the success. It's not the Shakespeare guy, it's me, Will Kemp. They love my dancing. And by the way, he specialized in something called jigs, G-I-G. These were they're almost like satyr plays in Greek tragedy, but he would script or improvise a little dancing act at the end of the plays. And I think Shakespeare got disgusted with that because, you've just written your great play and then you got to end with a Will Kemp jig. And there are lots of jibes against bad comedians in Hamlet. When Hamlet's instructing the players, he basically says, stop improvising, speak the speech as I wrote it. And it may reveal the tension between Shakespeare and Will Kemp. And it's an interesting fact that Falstaff was, to that point, the most popular character Shakespeare had ever written. And then we come to Henry V, and Falstaff's been mysteriously killed off. He's already dead. And people have often wondered, Shakespeare had this great character, Falstaff, why did he kill him off? I think he was trying to kill Will Kemp off. Anyway, this is just conjecture, but it just shows you that Shakespeare's dealing with the realities of a theater company. That would be the entrepreneurial aspect. He can adapt. He doesn't say, oh, Will Kemp's gone, I'm lost. I can't do anything else now. I'm going to retire. That's what Kemp probably wanted him to say. Instead, Shakespeare found Robert Armin. They had another comedian, and Robert Armin specialized in playing fools. He evidently had a good singing voice. And so late 1590s, 1600, we get these switch in Shakespeare's plays where he switches from a clown to a fool. Dogberry, Lancelot Gobbo, they're clowns, and they were suited to Will Kemp's shtick. But Shakespeare starts writing fools into his plays, Feste in Twelfth Night, Touchstone and As You Like It. And suddenly this character sings beautiful songs, as Kemp never did. And he doesn't have dialogues with himself, but plays the role of a fool. And again, this would be, I wish I could say, Shakespeare just thought, I got to switch from clowns to fools. The fools will be more profound and philosophical, and maybe that's part of it. But it really looks as if it's Shakespeare adapting to what was at first a glitch in the theater company. We've lost one of our biggest names. What are we going to do? And Shakespeare's answer is, leave it to me. I write the plays. I write the best plays. I can write an As You Like It. I can write a 12th Night, it'll be fine. And then Shakespeare really shows he's Shakespeare. He must have been impressed with Robert Armin, what he did for the theater company. And so he said, I'm going to write the greatest fool in world literature. I'm going to write a fool like you've never seen before. I'm going to take a fool to the next level, and that was King Lear. And that's an incredible role, and one must imagine how great Armin must have been to play it. It's a fool, and he's very funny, but the pathos is overwhelming in the play. And so here's one of the greatest results of Shakespeare's genius, the fool in King Lear. Anybody can write the character of King Lear, ha ha ha, but who could write the character of the fool? Sir Philip Sidney, the great Elizabethan poet, had complained about English plays. As he put it, they mixed hornpipes and funerals. He hated the idea that there were always clowns on the English stage. They loved people like William Kemp, and earlier a guy named Richard Tarleton. And as Shakespeare said, "You don't like hornpipes and funerals? Wait till you see King Lear, the most tragic play ever written, and it's going to have a fool in it, and he's going to rip your heart out." Here's one of the greatest things Shakespeare ever achieved, the fool in King Lear. I don't think it would have happened if it weren't for Robert Armin. If Shakespeare hadn't met in his theater company an actor whom he thought could play this role. And of course, it took Shakespeare to write the role to make it as great as it was for Robert Armin. So this would be my example, where the fact that Shakespeare is commercial doesn't limit his art, it doesn't cheapen his art, it raises it to a whole new level. And this is what entrepreneurs do. They take any product and they push it to a new level. Shakespeare's writing for the theater, he pushes theater to a new level. And it was, again, risk-taking. It was an enormous risk to put the fool in King Lear. First of all, he didn't know that Robert Armin was equal to the part. Would he just make the play awful by ruining it with jokes the way Will Kemp evidently had been doing? And would it even work? He had the evidence of Philip Sidney saying, you can't do this, you can't mix comedy and tragedy. But Shakespeare took an enormous chance, and the result is his masterpiece, and honestly, in my opinion, the greatest product of the human imagination. So on that note, I'll end, and I will be happy to take questions.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for an extremely informative and entertaining lecture. I noticed that unless you have some very detailed notes on your computer screen, which we cannot see, you appear to be delivering this lecture in an extremely articulate and organized fashion extemporaneously. Okay, there you go.
Like Barrett.
I was going to say, I haven't seen a performance like that since yesterday in the Supreme Court hearings. There's quite a few questions in the Q&A window, and I believe only the questioners and we panelists can see them. So let me take them a little bit out of order, and I'll start with one or two questions that are more closely related to your specific theme in the lecture, and then generalize to talk about this topic more broadly. And there are several people who are interested in your own personal story, how you came to hold the views that you have. But let me start with this question. If we accept your thesis that Shakespeare was an extremely successful entrepreneur, maybe the first great commercial entrepreneur, artist entrepreneur, are there things that we can learn about Shakespeare's experiences that might generalize to other contexts? For example, in entrepreneurship studies, we're interested in things like, how do particular individuals tend to be successful in pursuing these kinds of ventures? Do we know whether Shakespeare, do you think he was sort of born with an innate, intuitive sense of how the commercial world and the commercial art world operated? Or did he have some early attempts at artistic entrepreneurship that failed, and he learned from those attempts and eventually developed these skills? What do we know about how Shakespeare came to be as successful as he was?
Okay, we don't know any of those details, but his father was a businessman, a rather successful one, although he ended up in debt and having to flee his debtors. His father was in the glove business, so, Shakespeare grew up in a very middle-class home and was surrounded by businessmen. By the way, again, that's the profile of most of the Elizabethan playwrights. Marlowe's father, a shoemaker, Johnson's a bricklayer. So, these crazy theories that an aristocrat wrote the plays would have some cogency if every other playwright was an aristocrat and only Shakespeare was middle class, but it's just the opposite. Most of the playwrights were from the middle class. And so so Shakespeare was not born a businessman. He would have grown up in a world where he would have learned what business is, what it is to make a living. He undoubtedly was exceedingly intelligent, and so he had that advantage. And the thing I would stress about him is that he evidently was a risk taker, because it was a big risk to pull up stakes in Stratford and go to London. I suspect, for example, he showed up in the London theater world with a heavy Warwickshire accent, and they must have laughed at him. How can you be a player? They'll just laugh you off the stage. I don't know if you guys know how different English regional accents are, but you can't understand anyone from Liverpool to this day. Remember the Beatles? So I think it took a lot of courage. He probably got up on the stage the first time still with his Warwickshire accent, and they were pelting him with rotten vegetables. So I believe he was very ambitious. And again, in terms of risk taking, there must have been a day when he said to the Burbages, James, Richard, I could write a play too, and they must have laughed at him. And they said, look, here's a play by Bob Greene, write a few scenes for it, we'll see what happens. And so fortunately had a huge success with Titus Andronicus. They were playing that thing 30 years later, much to Ben Jonson's disgust. So it's very hard to be specific about it, but what I think we see about Shakespeare is he had real ambitions, and he wasn't afraid to take chances, and he really worked at it. I think he must have studied very hard to get rid of that Warwickshire accent. And he in effect studied playwriting. Shakespeare did not go to a university. Marlowe did, but he didn't exactly study anything there, though. But there's this idea, Shakespeare couldn't have written the plays. He didn't go to a university. Shakespeare went to the best university in the world, the Lord Chamberlain's Company. And he learned to write plays by working with the best working playwrights of his day. So, I hate to bring back Shark Tank, but he shows many of the qualities that the sharks admire. And above all, this kind of courage. It's, again, very hard to read specific lessons. And Shakespeare he did have a genius to back up everything he did. I can think time and again, people must have just been amazed what he said he was going to do, and then he did it. And he said, give me a season with Fletcher. You'll see, we'll have my successor. And it happened.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just to follow up on that a little bit, as entrepreneurship educators, my colleagues and I are always thinking about this tension between the aspects of entrepreneurship that are teachable in a formal classroom setting and the aspects of entrepreneurship that really can only be learned experientially through even sort of an apprenticeship model, as you described. But I guess that's why mentoring is an extremely important part of practical business education in entrepreneurship and other fields. I also noticed you mentioned, well, let me back up. So sometimes we think of entrepreneurs beginning with a picture in their minds of exactly the kind of venture or product or service or environment they want to create, and then they simply acquire the resources necessary to bring it into being, and poof, there it is. Probably it's more realistic to think that in many cases, entrepreneurs are stuck with kind of the people they know and the skills they have and the resources available to them right, at the present, and they try to make the best possible product that they can out of those resources that are currently at hand. I was struck in your discussion of how, for example, Shakespeare would write plays to accommodate the actors in his company, right, rather than write a play abstractly and then simply hire the actors that are necessary to perform it. Do you have any further comments on to what extent he sort of adapted to what he had as opposed to thinking, outside the box?
Yeah, I think this is where academics, I think, have a very hard time comprehending Shakespeare, because they, generally speaking, work alone. They think of authors as working alone. Shakespeare evidently could work well with others. We once had a great Hollywood comedy writer come speak at the University of Virginia, and he was talking about what it would take to succeed in Hollywood writing for a sitcom. And he said, you come up with an idea for a joke, fight for it, act like you're willing to die for it for 5 minutes. And then if the other writers don't like it, forget it, move on. You got to live with these other writers for years. I'm sure Shakespeare had to make compromises, but he seems to have been willing to do it. And I give, in general, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the King's Men, credit for adaptability. Now, a lot of money was at stake. I didn't pull my 600-pound figure out of a hat in my Shark Tank skit. That's what Burbage had to put up to lease the Blackfriars Theater. And that's a lot of money. Again, it's hard to relate to modern prices, but that's probably several $100,000 in today's terms. And so they did have to raise money. I mean, it was one of the more heavily capitalized industries in the London at the time. There was big money at stake. So they did have to raise money. They raised money from aristocrats, but also from businessmen. And so the English department image of Shakespeare is as this solitary genius, and everything comes out of his mind. A lot of truth to that. He could write great poetry, seems almost spontaneously, but the actual production of the plays, getting them on stage, performed by actual actors, that took some form of cooperation on his part. And the contemporary comments on him, to the extent they're personal, say that he was gentle. Now that in part means he was a gentleman, and that was what he craved being. It was his great desire to become a gentleman and get a coat of arms for his family, as he ultimately did. But I think that does refer to the fact that he could sit down with other people, and I suspect he was a very good listener. And that would be part of being a good entrepreneur.
Terrific. Thank you. There's a question here from one of the English professors in the audience. Happy to have our colleagues here with us. Do any successful entrepreneurs appear as characters in Shakespeare's plays? So Shylock in The Merchant of Venice may be, I'm quoting the question here, reading the question, may be too obvious of a starting point for thinking about the darkness that sometimes accompanies the art of money lending in Shakespeare's mind. But are there any entrepreneurial virtues championed within Shakespeare's works, such as he himself practiced?
The funny thing is, my basic answer is no. That Ben Jonson appreciated entrepreneurs more than Shakespeare did. And that if you want to see a play from that time that celebrates entrepreneurship, it is Jonson's Bartholomew Fair, which I think is his greatest play. And it's about theatrical entrepreneurs, is the joke of it. And he really does understand the virtues of a free market. The villains in Bartholomew Fair are central planners who try to regulate the market, either from a political or religious end. But it is, I mean, to me, Shakespeare has an aristocratic view of the world, despite the fact that he was middle class. And he mainly celebrates the aristocratic virtues. The typical hero in Shakespeare is a warrior. And Shakespeare typically admires courage in the raw sense of the ability to fight. It's funny, he was himself middle class, but he didn't tend to celebrate the middle class. In fact, I think he's rather skeptical of the middle class. If you look at plays like The Merry Wives of Windsor, All's Well That Ends Well, he was very suspicious of the social climbing aspect of the middle class, even though he was the all-time social climber and managed to be a nobody from Stratford who ended up, mixing with aristocrats and maybe even meeting the Queen at some point, or the King in James's time. The Merchant of Venice is very interesting in the sense that Shakespeare does show that commerce can bring people together and bridge the kinds of gaps that can destroy communities like religious warfare. But ultimately, I think Shakespeare is worried that the effect of this is to lower the tone of the whole of society, and that if people turn to commerce and turn away from things they were dying for, like religious differences, that they will become much more mediocre. I was very struck by the opening lines in Merchant of Venice, where one of Shylock's one of the Christian merchants says, I can't go to church without thinking of the danger my cargoes are undergoing on the seas. And that's a perfect moment for Shakespeare's Venice, that the Christians there are not very high-minded, but they're thinking of business even in the middle of church. And I think Shakespeare's actually worried about that. Whereas Ben Jonson actually is fascinated. He sees England already being torn apart by what became the Puritans versus the Cavaliers. And in The Alchemist and Bartholomew Fair, he suggests if people can just devote themselves to commerce, they can overcome these destructive differences between them. But again, I think the virtues in Shakespeare are largely the aristocratic virtues. In Coriolanus, it said, early in the play, it is held that valor is the chiefest virtue. That's not the bourgeois ethic. So.
Yeah, although I suppose we could ascribe valor to some of our great entrepreneurs as well. Let me transition to, I'll make this a two-part question about you and your own interests and your own career. I mean, first, what inspired you to devote your life and career to the study of William Shakespeare and Shakespeare's works? And second, how did you become interested in the links between literature or art and commerce, and specifically what made you want to write about Shakespeare as a business person or business issues that come up in Shakespeare's works? That's not a typical move for an accomplished English professor.
The answer to the first question is my mother. My mother was born on April 23rd, same day as Shakespeare, and she herself had an MA in English. She took me to Shakespeare plays. Early in life, I had the great good fortune of seeing Morris Karnofsky play King Lear at the Stratford Theater in Stratford, Connecticut. It's the greatest performance of King Lear I've ever seen, maybe the greatest performance of anything I've ever seen. And so I really was very taken with Shakespeare. Actually, Merchant of Venice was one of the plays I first was moved by. I had the great good fortune of studying Julius Caesar in junior high school, and I did my first reading of Shakespeare criticism in connection with that. So, I mean, I really responded to Shakespeare. Just the sound of it, and I was fascinated by the difference of it, the different worlds he portrayed. I remember turning the dial on a radio one Saturday night to WBAI in New York, and I heard something I had no idea. I knew it was Shakespeare, but I didn't know what a play was until someone shouted out, Caius Marcius Coriolanus, and then I discovered this play Coriolanus. So I grew attached to Shakespeare uh, very early on. Now, quite parallel to this, I will say I came from a middle class family in Brooklyn, and I remember the earliest conversations around dinner were about the stock market, and my family was involved in various businesses, so I was hearing a lot about business. I was interested in it, and but this was quite separate from my interest in Shakespeare at the time. And then I grew interested in Austrian economics while I was still in high school. Actually, through a strange series of events, ended up attending Ludwig von Mises's seminar at New York University Graduate School of Business Research. So I had the ultimate training in Austrian economics. But these interests basically ran separate for years. And at the same time, I was very interested in television and movies, especially television and popular culture. And then in the late 1980s, as a joke, I started giving lectures on things like The Simpsons and Gilligan's Island, and it really was a parody of a lecture and making fun of how people were taking television seriously. And then I noticed students were taking me seriously, and I was getting a lot of response. So in the 90s, everything suddenly coalesced. My interest in popular culture, my interest in Shakespeare, and my interest in Austrian economics. For the 10th anniversary of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, there was an essay contest, and I was one of the winners with an essay on Thomas Mann and the German inflation, his story, Disorder and Early Sorrow. And then I began to see that many of the principles that worked in popular culture work in so-called high culture as well. For example, sequels. The Elizabethan theater was the first mode of popular entertainment that had sequels. Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2. And that principle obviously works in Hollywood as well. And so I began to see that there were many similarities between high culture and pop culture. And then I remembered that Shakespeare was the pop culture of his day. And I've come to the conclusion that the difference we draw between pop culture and high culture is largely artificial. And basically our high culture is the pop culture of earlier days. So I have a very short attention span and have never pursued anything to the exclusion of everything else. So I had all these different ideas floating in my mind. And eventually they did coalesce in ways that I think are productive.
That's terrific, and I think your talk tonight and your many writings also illustrate the complementarities between these different things. We often tell our students here at Baylor, like at other universities, that they, even if they're interested in business or science or mathematics, they need to be well-rounded. They need to have a traditional liberal education and so forth to make them, good citizens and to give them a certain perspective on life and to make them good dinner table companions and so forth. But what I'm hearing you say is that studying Shakespeare and other great artists can also inspire and teach us about how to be successful in business and how to be how to do well in other aspects of life. So we're very happy that you could share those insights with us. I've gotten a lot of comments in the chat window or the Q&A window that are really not questions, but just expressions of appreciation for your talk and for you opening people's eyes to a new way to think about Shakespeare and a new way to think about culture and commerce, or high culture and low culture. And I hope that those of you listening today will check out Professor Cantor's books, and you can check out his website, which has other lectures that he's given. And this lecture will eventually be posted on the Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise YouTube page, where you can enjoy it along with lectures from some of our previous speakers. So Paul, thanks again for being the greatest virtual Free Enterprise Forum speaker we've ever had, the only one we've ever had, but really look forward to having you come visit us in person when that becomes possible. So thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks to our generous sponsors who make these events possible. And we will see all of you the next time.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I was wondering, how am I going to tell if people are walking out on my lecture? And now I do have a real-time count, and I kept most of the audience, so I feel very satisfied with that. But I do hope I can visit Baylor for real someday soon.
Terrific. Okay, thanks, Paul, and thanks to everybody for coming, and good night.